Welcome to another episode of Books and Bytes. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. That line, well, it's arguably one of the most famous opening sentences in political history.
Absolutely. It belongs to a document that has undeniably changed the world, sparked revolutions, and it's still intensely debated today.
And today, we're embarking on a deep dive into Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' The Communist Manifesto.
And to really understand this pivotal text, we're drawing not just from the manifesto itself, but also from selected bits of Marx's broader work, like the 18th Brumaire and Capital.
Right.
And crucially, our stack includes a critical introduction that gives us essential context and, well, even evaluates Marx's ideas from a different viewpoint.
Absolutely. So our mission here is pretty precise. Just following the source material we have in front of us, we want to unpack the core ideas Marx and Engels laid out.
Yeah, unpack them.
We're not here to argue for or against them or, take sides. We're just here to understand their analysis of history and capitalism, their vision for the future.
And why these ideas became so influential, based purely on, let's say, the blueprint they presented and the context our sources give us.
Think of it as trying on Marx's glasses for a bit, guided by our sources to see the world as he described it.
Exactly. And we've also got those critical notes from the introduction to keep in mind.
Okay, let's get started. Let's dig into what our source material presents as the very foundation of Marx's thought. Historical materialism, sometimes called the materialist conception of history. What's the core idea here? What makes it revolutionary?
Well, the fundamental insight Marx arrived at, according to our sources, is that things like legal systems, political structures, even forms of consciousness, our ideas, beliefs, they aren't the main drivers of history or society. Instead, they're rooted in and determined by the material conditions of life. It's sort of a complete flip of the traditional view.
So it's not great ideas changing the world first, but rather the practical ways people live and, produce things.
Exactly. Yeah. Marx argues that as people engage in production, the social production of their material life, they enter into specific, definite relationships with each other. These are the relations of production.
Okay.
And crucially, these aren't voluntary. They're indispensable, independent of individual will, and they correspond directly to the stage of development of their material forces of production.
The tools, the technology, labor skills, how advanced they are dictates the kind of production relationships people have. Is that it?
Precisely. And the sum total of these relationships, that forms the economic structure of society.
Right.
This economic structure is, according to Marx, the real foundation. It's the base upon which the legal and political superstructure is built, and to which definite forms of social consciousness correspond.
So the key takeaway here, the sort of revolutionary insight Marx delivers, is that it's not consciousness that determines our social existence, but rather our social existence, the material, economic way we live and produce, that determines our consciousness, our way of thinking.
That's the bedrock principle, yeah. Now, Marx identifies that at a certain point in history, the material forces of production developing within society can come into conflict with the existing relations of production, which he also talks about in terms of property relations. When these relations, which maybe once helped development, become fetters, obstacles on the productive forces, that signals the beginning of an epoch of social revolution.
It's like the old economic structure just can't contain the new productive capacity anymore. It forces a transformation of the whole social and political system built on top of it.
That's the idea. But our source points out an interesting paradox here. Individuals are conscious, right? They act with purpose. They invent things. Yet their social life develops, Marx argues, independently of their collective thought and will. It's almost like it has a life of its own.
How does that work?
Well, this points to the concept of objective development. The introduction we have uses the analogy of a free market. Individuals chase their own interests, but the overall outcome market prices, resource allocation, isn't consciously planned by anyone.
Right, the invisible hand idea almost.
Sort of like that, yeah. Marx applies this to the long sweep of economic history. He suggests it follows its own inexorable laws, passing through definite stages or modes of production.
And he borrowed the idea of dialectical movement, often linked with Hegel, but applied it to this economic base.
Right. The existing mode of production is the thesis.
Yeah.
It generates internal contradictions, opposing forces. That's the antithesis.
Okay.
The resolution of this conflict leads to a new economic system, the synthesis. But crucially for Marx, the motor driving this whole process isn't the clash of ideas, but the development of the productive forces.
Well, let's make sure we're clear on that term, productive forces, because it seems central.
It really is.
Yeah.
The source defines it as the elements of the mode of production. So we're talking about tools, machines, factories, raw materials. The labor itself, skilled, unskilled, technical. The organization of that labor, like an assembly line and the techniques used. All the stuff that goes into making things.
And while inventions like Watt's steam engine obviously involve human thought,
Of course.
their consequences, as the source notes, can be huge and unforeseen, like those dark satanic mills that sprung up.
Exactly. And the source points out that before modern times, changes in the organization of production were often more significant drivers than inventions themselves.
Interesting.
This historical development, Marx argues, is generally gradual within a particular mode of production.
Yeah.
But the transitions between these stages, they're catastrophic, revolutionary.
The idea that changes in quantity become a change in quality. Small changes pile up until, boom, a revolutionary qualitative shift in the economic system.
Which then triggers a political revolution. That's the link. And the source explicitly calls this concept economic development through stages, driven by productive forces, leading to revolution, a pillar of the dogma of revolution.
So that's the big picture, the historical framework. How does Marx apply this specifically to the capitalism he saw emerging all around him?
Right, the source moves us straight into this. The general materialist laws still apply, but capitalism has its own unique dynamics, its special laws or economic law of motion, which he really dug into in Capital.
Okay.
And, as our source notes, the cornerstone of Marx's economic analysis is the labor theory of value, LTV.
Now, this wasn't entirely new, right? Earlier economists like Smith and Ricardo talked about labor and value.
That's true. It's presented as the theory of price, fundamentally. What makes completely different goods exchangeable at a certain ratio? Why does X amount of cloth equal Y amount of iron?
Yeah.
Marx, building on those predecessors, concluded it was the quantity of socially necessary labor embodied in them, the average labor time needed under normal conditions.
Okay, but our source is pretty direct in its critique of the labor theory of value, at least as an explanation for prices in a complex modern economy.
It is. It calls it hopeless for explaining modern prices and mentions that Marx himself seemed to, well, struggle with it in the later volumes of Capital. But, and this is key, despite its issues as a theory of price, Marx uses it as the foundation for something really central. His theory of surplus value. This is his explanation of exploitation under capitalism.
And the source is careful to clarify here. Marx isn't just saying capitalists are morally bad people, simply robbing the worker in a, straightforward sense.
No, it's more systemic than that in his view. The framework suggests that within the capitalist system itself, each party actually receives their due according to the system's own rules. The exploitation is built into the structure.
How so?
The key is to understand the unique commodity the worker sells. It's not their completed labor, but their capacity to work, their labor power.
Labor power itself is a commodity, like buying coal or cotton.
Exactly. And like any commodity, its value is determined by the labor needed to produce and reproduce it. In this case, the labor needed to keep the worker alive, fed, clothed, housed, and able to come back to work the next day.
Which translates roughly to a subsistence wage.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Enough to maintain and reproduce the worker. So the capitalist pays the worker the value of their labor power.
Okay, makes sense so far.
Right. But here's the critical step, according to Marx. The worker, having sold their labor power for the day, then works for the whole agreed-upon time, say 10 hours. Marx argues the worker might create value equivalent to their wage in only a portion of that working day, maybe the first 5 or 6 hours.
Right.
The value created in the remaining hours, that extra time, that's the surplus value. And this value is appropriated by the capitalist. It becomes their profit, interest, rent.
So the exploitation in Marx's analysis isn't about the wage being unfairly low in some abstract sense, but about the capitalist structure allowing them to capture the value created beyond the cost of the worker's own labor power.
That's the mechanism of surplus value, as the source explained it. Now, what happens to this surplus value? Is it all just blown on luxuries?
That's the image some people have, right? Mansions and yachts.
According to the source's presentation of Marx, while it happens, the systemic drive is more important. It's the drive towards accumulation. Capitalists are basically forced by competition to reinvest their profits back into the business.
How so?
To buy more and better machinery, expand factories, increase productivity. The source actually notes Marx's grasp of this reinvestment process, and its central importance was remarkable for his time. They have to accumulate or they'll be crushed by more efficient competitors.
It's not just greed, it's survival within the system.
That's the argument. And this intense competition also leads to another process, the centralization of capital.
Meaning?
Bigger, more productive firms inevitably beat smaller, less efficient ones. Think economies of scale. This leads to fewer but much, much larger capitalist enterprises, monopolies, oligopolies.
And the source praises Marx's foresight here too, anticipating the rise of big business.
It does. And it makes an interesting side point. Neither accumulation nor centralization actually depend on the labor theory of value being correct to be observed as real phenomena. Even defenders of capitalism might see them as just, well, economic progress, efficiency winning out.
But Marx sees these very processes, accumulation, centralization, leading directly to fundamental contradictions within capitalism itself.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And maybe the most striking contradiction he identifies concerns the worker. As the productive forces grow massively, as capitalist wealth accumulates, it gets concentrated. The modern laborer, according to Marx's analysis in the Manifesto, sinks deeper into poverty relative to the wealth being created. They become a pauper.
Wow.
And this pauperism, he argues, grows even faster than both population and wealth. It's a stark picture of widening inequality.
And based on this observation, Marx makes a really powerful claim. The bourgeoisie is no longer fit to rule.
Because their system, he argues, cannot even guarantee a basic existence for the very class it relies on, the workers, their slaves, in his terminology. Instead of the workers feeding the system, the bourgeoisie ends up having to support the impoverished workers through poor relief and so on. Bourgeois existence, Marx concludes in the source, is just no longer compatible with the needs of society.
And this leads directly to that really famous, almost chilling idea. Capitalism produces its own gravediggers.
The proletarians. The source quotes Marx and Engels directly here. The fall of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the proletariat are not just likely, they're equally inevitable. It's presented as a historical certainty.
The system also seems prone to break down periodically, right?
Yeah.
Leading to economic crises.
Yes, those cycles where industry and commerce just grind to a halt. Our source does note that Marx and Engels don't offer a fully fleshed out economic explanation for why capitalism must inevitably collapse entirely. But they interpret these increasingly severe crises as clear proof that the productive forces have become fettered, constrained by the existing capitalist mode of production, by private property relations.
And they describe one type of crisis very specifically as an epidemic of overproduction.
Right. It's a strange kind of crisis, isn't it? Too much civilization, too many means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces are just too powerful for the conditions of bourgeois property. They create disorder and endanger the very system that spawned them.
So how does the bourgeoisie try to overcome these crises, according to the Manifesto?
Well, a couple of ways. One is by the forced destruction of productive forces, closing factories, letting fields lie fallow, basically destroying wealth. The other is by conquering new markets or more intensely exploiting existing ones.
But that's not a long-term fix.
You know, the source points out that Marx sees this as just kicking the can down the road. It merely paves the way for more extensive and more destructive crises in the future and actually diminishes the means of preventing them.
So the very tools the bourgeoisie used to build its power, those massive productive forces,
are ultimately turned against it. The weapons used to defeat feudalism are now aimed at the bourgeoisie itself, constrained by the property relations they established.
And these same forces, this development of industry, call into being the class that will ultimately wield those weapons. The modern working class, the proletariat.
Exactly. As capital develops, so does this class of wage laborers. They survive only as long as they can find work, and they find work only as long as their labor increases capital. They are, in essence, a commodity, subject to all the ups and downs of competition and the market.
And the work itself changes, becoming increasingly dehumanized by machinery and the division of labor.
Yeah, it loses its individual character, any sense of craft or charm. The worker becomes, in Marx's vivid phrase, an appendage of the machine. Only the simplest, most monotonous knack is required.
And the cost of producing this worker, their wage?
Falls to the minimum, the bare subsistence level. The source even notes the wage tends to decrease as the work becomes more repulsive and less skilled. And the burden of toil increases, longer hours, faster pace, more demanded in the same amount of time.
The factory itself becomes a kind of military-style despotism.
Very much so. Organized like soldiers under a hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Workers aren't just slaves to the capitalist class in the state, but daily slaves to the machine. the overseer, the individual factory owner. And the more openly the system aims at profit, the source says, the more petty, hateful, and embittering this despotism feels.
And traditional distinctions, age, sex, they lose their social importance.
They become less relevant, yeah. Everyone is just an instrument of labor, costing more or less depending on age and sex, but fundamentally just tools for creating value.
And the exploitation doesn't stop when the worker leaves the factory gate.
No, according to the source. Once they get their wages, they're immediately set upon by other parts of the bourgeoisie. The landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker. The exploitation continues.
And the proletariat isn't just made up of people born into factory work. It actively recruits from other classes that are sinking.
Right. Small tradespeople, shopkeepers, artisans, even peasants, the lower strata of the middle class. They can't compete with the scale of modern industry. Their small capital isn't enough. Their specialized skills become devalued. So they fall into the proletariat, which recruits from all classes of the population.
So this growing mass of workers, how do they evolve from scattered individuals into a revolutionary force? What are the stages of their struggle described in the source?
Well, it starts small. Initially, it's individual laborers, maybe then workers in a single factory, or workers in one trade in one location, fighting against the individual capitalists who directly exploit them.
And their targets might not even be the system itself at first.
Exactly. Early on, they might attack the instruments of production, destroying foreign goods that compete with theirs, smashing machinery, burning factories. They're trying, in a way, to restore the lost status of the medieval workman. It's backward-looking initially.
But at this stage, they're still fragmented, divided by competition among themselves.
Very much so. Any mass action or union is often, paradoxically, initiated or manipulated by the bourgeoisie itself for its own political fights against the monarchy, landowners, etc. So every victory gained at this stage is actually a victory for the bourgeoisie.
But things change as industry develops further.
Yes. The proletariat increases in number, it becomes concentrated in larger masses, its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. Machinery tends to equalize conditions and wages, pushing them down to a similar low level everywhere. Growing competition among the bourgeoisie and the resulting commercial crises make wages even more fluctuating and unstable. Continuous improvement of machinery makes the worker's livelihood increasingly precarious.
So individual clashes start to feel more like class clashes?
Right. Collisions between individual workers and individual capitalists take on the character of collisions between two classes. Workers begin to form combinations, trade unions against the bourgeoisie to keep up wages. They form more permanent associations to prepare for these occasional revolts.
And the struggle sometimes breaks out into riots.
It does. The victories might be temporary, but the source emphasizes the real lasting fruit of their battles isn't the immediate result, but the ever-expanding union of the workers.
And modern communication helps this process.
Massively. Things like railways, which the bourgeoisie created for its own purposes, allow workers to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between classes.
And what took medieval burghers centuries to achieve?
The union, organization. Modern proletarians, thanks to railways and communication, can achieve in just a few years.
And crucially, every class struggle is also a political struggle.
Yes. This organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, is constantly being upset by competition between the workers themselves. But it always rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier each time.
And it starts to win political victories.
It compels legislative recognition of particular interests. The source gives the example of the 10 Hours Bill in England, achieved by exploiting divisions within the ruling class itself.
And here's that almost ironic twist again. The bourgeoisie actually helps arm the proletariat for this fight.
It does in several ways. By needing the workers' help in its own political battles against the aristocracy, against sections of the bourgeoisie whose interests conflict with industrial progress, against the bourgeoisie of foreign countries, they drag the proletariat into the political arena.
Oh no, doing so.
They supply the proletariat with what the source calls elements of political and general education, basically. The tools and understanding needed to eventually fight the bourgeoisie itself. They provide the weapons.
Plus, you get defectors from the ruling class.
Yes. As industry advances and threatens the existence of certain sections of the ruling class, or when parts of the bourgeoisie, particularly ideologists, grasp the historical movement theoretically. A section joins the revolutionary class. the proletariat.
The source presents the proletariat as the only truly revolutionary class in this context.
That's right. Other classes that fight against the bourgeoisie, the lower middle class, the small manufacturer, shopkeeper, artisan, peasant, they're fighting to save their existence from extinction. So they're not revolutionary, but conservative, or even reactionary, trying to roll back history.
They want to preserve their past or present status.
Exactly. The proletariat, on the other hand, is the special and essential product of modern industry. It has no past status in this system to preserve. It's fundamentally tied to the future development driven by those productive forces. It's the only class whose interests align with overturning the whole system.
What about the social scum, the lumpen proletariat?
The source mentions them, the dangerous class, the passively decaying lowest layers of old society. It suggests they might get swept into the movement here and there, but their conditions of life make them more likely to be bought off and used by reactionary forces.
So the proletariat stands distinct, stripped of property, of traditional family relations in the bourgeois sense, even of national character by globalized industry.
Yes, the source argues the social conditions of the old society are already largely destroyed for them. Law, morality, religion, these are seen through that materialist lens again, as just so many bourgeois prejudices behind which lurk bourgeois interests.
And their mission, therefore, isn't to gain property within the existing system because they fundamentally have none.
Correct. Their mission is to abolish the entire existing mode of appropriation, to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property.
Because bourgeois private property is the final form.
The final and most complete expression of that system based on class antagonisms and exploitation. So they have, as the source puts it, nothing of their own to secure. Their historical task is to destroy all ways individual property has been secured through exploitation in the past.
And this is presented not as a minority movement, but as a movement of the vast majority.
Yes, in the interest of the vast majority. This is contrasted with all previous historical movements, which were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The proletariat, the lowest stratum, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole superstructure of official society being sprung into the air.
And the source, including the introduction's commentary, points out that all the elements of Marx's system, as presented here, converge on one necessary method for this overthrow.
That the inevitable class struggle, the civil war simmering within society, must eventually break out into open revolution, and that the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie is necessary to lay the foundation for the proletariat's rule.
Okay, so if the proletariat is the revolutionary class, the agent of change, where do the communists fit into this picture? Our source says they aren't just a separate party with different goals.
Correct. The manifesto is clear. Communists don't form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They don't set up any sectarian principles to shape the movement.
So what does distinguish them then, if they're part of the broader movement?
According to the source, two key things stand out. First, in the national struggles of the proletarians of different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of nationality. They're internationalists.
Okay.
Second, in the various stages of development the struggle goes through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. They keep the end goal in sight.
So this gives them a kind of broader, more strategic perspective.
You could say that. It gives them, in the source's words, the practical advantage over the general mass of the proletariat of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the movement.
Their immediate aim, though, is the same as other proletarian parties. Get the proletariat organized into a class, overthrow the bourgeoisie, conquer political power.
Exactly. And their theoretical conclusions, the source stresses, aren't based on some abstract ideas or principles they invented. They merely express, in general terms, the actual relations springing from the existing class struggle, from the historical movement going on before their eyes.
Which brings us right back to that core defining idea we touched on earlier, the abolition of property.
Specifically, the abolition of bourgeois private property. That's the key distinction. Abolishing property relations in general isn't unique to communism. History is full of such changes. But abolishing bourgeois property.
Why is that the focus?
Because, as Marx argues, modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonism, on the exploitation of the many by the few.
So the theory of the communists, as the source states very bluntly, can be summed up in that single sentence: abolition of private property.
That's the concise heart of it, as presented in the manifesto. It's the central plank.
Okay. The manifesto then anticipates and tackles head-on several objections it expects from the bourgeoisie. The source walks us through these. Let's take them one by one. First, the charge that communism abolishes hard-won, personally earned property, and therefore individuality and freedom.
Right. Marx and Engels counter this by saying, what property are you talking about? They argue they mean bourgeois property, which relies on capital and wage labor, on exploitation. They're not talking about the property of the small artisan or peasant modern industry is already destroying that anyway.
So it's a specific kind of property.
Yes. And bourgeois freedom, they argue, is really just freedom of trade, freedom to buy and sell. If you abolish buying and selling, you abolish that specific freedom. The bourgeois, the source suggests, Marx implies, can only conceive of their own type of property, individuality, and freedom as being valid at all.
Okay, what about the objection that if you abolish private property, everyone will just stop working? Universal laziness will set in.
The response presented is almost mocking. They say, look, in bourgeois society, those who work don't acquire property, and those who do acquire property don't work. If work stopped when wage labor ceased, bourgeois society should have collapsed from laziness long ago.
Huh, right.
The argument is that communism doesn't abolish the appropriation of the products of labor for personal existence. It abolishes the miserable character of that appropriation under capitalism, where the laborer lives only to increase capital for someone else.
Next charge. Communism abolishes culture.
The counter is that what the bourgeois calls culture is, for the vast majority, merely training to act as a machine. Losing class culture, the specific culture and ideas of the ruling class, isn't the same as losing all culture. Ruling ideas and laws, they argue again, are just reflections of the economic conditions and interests of the ruling class.
Then there's the very sensitive issue of abolishing the family.
Yeah, the source explains their position. The bourgeois family, they argue, is based on capital, on private gain. Its hidden complement is the practical absence of the family among the proletariat and the existence of public prostitution. Both, Marx believes, will naturally vanish when capital vanishes.
So they're not against family ties per se.
They counter the accusation about abolishing the relationship between parents and children by saying they want to stop the exploitation of children by their parents within the capitalist system, like child labor. Education, too, is already social and influenced by the ruling class. Communists just want to alter its character, rescue it from ruling class influence.
Okay, now, perhaps the most inflammatory charge. The idea of establishing a community of women.
Right. The source presents Marx and Engels' fiery response. They accuse the bourgeois of hypocrisy. The bourgeois, they say, sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. So, logically, if instruments of production are to be held in common, women would be too.
That's the bourgeois fear they're addressing.
Exactly. The communists' stated goal, however, is the opposite, to abolish the status of women as mere instruments of production. They argue they don't need to introduce a community of women because between widespread prostitution and bourgeois men seducing each other's wives, it already exists in a hypocritical, hidden form.
So what are they proposing instead?
Their proposal is framed as wanting to replace this hypocritically concealed system with an openly legalized community of women, which our source clarifies means abolishing the bourgeois form of marriage, seen as intrinsically tied to property and inheritance, not necessarily abolishing relationships themselves. It's about changing the socioeconomic basis.
Okay. What about abolishing countries and nationality?
The source quotes the famous line, "The working men have no country," in the bourgeois sense anyway. They argue the proletariat must first acquire political supremacy, must constitute itself in the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself as the nation.
But the goal is ultimately international.
Yes. National differences and antagonisms, they argue, are already vanishing due to bourgeois development, the world market, uniform production, etc. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish even faster. As class antagonism within nations ends, hostility between nations will also cease.
And finally, the big one, abolishing eternal truths, like religion, morality, philosophy itself.
This flows directly from historical materialism. The argument is that consciousness changes as material conditions and social relations change. The whole history of ideas proves that intellectual production changes along with material production.
Ruling ideas are ruling class ideas.
Always. Revolutionary ideas presuppose revolutionary changes in society. So those eternal truths, freedom, justice, etc., that seem universal. Marx argues they are common forms reflecting millennia of class society. They will only completely vanish with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. The communist revolution, therefore, means a radical rupture with traditional property relations, and thus a radical rupture with traditional ideas.
So after this revolution, after the proletariat takes power, what's the immediate first step, according to the manifesto?
The source states the first step is for the proletariat to raise itself to the position of the ruling class to, as they put it, win the battle of democracy.
Okay.
They will then use this political supremacy to wrest, gradually, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments for production factories, tools, land, transport in the hands of the state.
And the state at this point is the proletariat organized as the ruling class.
That's the concept. And the immediate aim is to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. This requires, they say, despotic inroads on the rights of property and bourgeois conditions of production.
And the manifesto actually lists some specific measures, doesn't it? Recognizing they might vary.
It does. It lists 10 measures described as pretty generally applicable in the most advanced countries. Our source lays them out clearly.
Let's quickly run through them.
Okay. 1. Abolition of private property and land. Use rents for public good. 2. A heavy progressive income tax. 3. Abolition of all rights of inheritance.
So breaking up concentrations of wealth.
Seems to be the goal.
Yeah.
4. Confiscation of property from immigrants and rebels.
Yeah.
5. Centralization of credit. A national bank with state capital. A state monopoly. 6. Centralization of communication and transport under the state.
State control of infrastructure and finance.
Right. 7. State ownership expanding factories, instruments of production, cultivating wastelands, improving soil under a common plan. 8. Equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture.
Everyone works.
That's the principle. 9. Combining agriculture and manufacturing. Gradually abolish the town-country distinction by distributing population more evenly. And 10. Free public education for all children. Abolish child factory labor in its current form. Combine education with industrial production.
Those are some very concrete, radical steps proposed for that initial post-revolution phase. What about the longer-term future vision described by Marx and Engels?
Well, the source outlines an intermediate stage after the overthrow, often referred to as socialism. Here, the economy is communally controlled, but the principle of distribution is still essentially based on contribution.
Meaning?
Individuals are paid according to the amount and quality of work they do. This reflects what Marx called bourgeois right. Inequalities still exist because people have different abilities and outputs. A form of state also remains the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Which isn't necessarily tyranny in their view?
No, Marx saw it as a democracy where the working class majority exercises power over the remaining minority elements of the old ruling classes during this transition.
And this state, the socialist phase, it's meant to be temporary.
Yes, according to Engels' later writings, which the source references, this state is expected to gradually wither away. As the cultural habits, the class differences, the ways of thinking inherited from the old system are overcome, the need for force and coercion diminishes.
Administration of things replaces administration of people.
That's the famous phrase, yeah, leading eventually to the final stage, communism.
And what characterizes full communism?
The fundamental principle of distribution changes. It shifts from to each according to his contribution, to the ideal of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Needs, not just work done.
Right. In this envisioned communist society, the state has withered away. Force and selfishness has supposedly vanished. Man is no longer alienated by private property, the market, the division of labor. He enters what the source somewhat poetically describes, citing the vision as an earthly paradise of perfect freedom and community.
It's a very powerful utopian vision. But this is exactly where our source's introduction offers a significant critical perspective, isn't it?
It is. It finds Marx's ultimate goal, this idea of a harmonious, selfless society, ancient and in no sense ignoble. It's an old dream, not inherently bad. But the introduction argues, this vision is also profoundly dangerous.
And the danger isn't just about whether the economics would work?
No, it's deeper than that. The specific criticism highlighted is that it's fundamentally false to teach that evil arises solely from economic institutions like private property. The author of the introduction points out, quite starkly, that human beings can be corrupted by power, by pride, by selfishness in any social system, regardless of its economic structure.
That seems like a crucial point about human nature.
It is. And the argument follows. A doctrine that doesn't recognize this enduring possibility, that assumes these negative traits will just magically vanish once economic conditions change.
Well, that doctrine is seen as an invitation to tyranny.
Why an invitation to tyranny? Because it doesn't build in any checks or balances against the abuse of power. If you believe your system inherently eliminates evil, you might not see the need to guard against it in the people running the system. It's a powerful counterpoint presented within the source material itself.
Definitely something to think about. Before we wrap up, the source also briefly touches on different types of socialist and communist literature that were around at the time Marx and Engels were writing.
Right. The manifesto has a section critiquing other socialist trends. It categorizes them into reactionary socialism, conservative or bourgeois socialism, and critical utopian socialism. It discusses figures like Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Robert Owen under that utopian banner.
And what was Marx and Engels' take on these utopians, according to the source?
Well, they acknowledged that the utopians saw class antagonism and the problems of capitalism. Their critiques had value. But Marx and Engels saw them as lacking an understanding of the historical and material conditions necessary for proletarian emancipation.
So they weren't grounded enough in reality.
Kind of. Instead of focusing on the proletariat's own revolutionary action, the utopians designed fantastic, often very detailed blueprints for ideal societies, and then tried to appeal to the existing ruling classes or philanthropists to implement them. Their proposals were deemed utopian because they weren't rooted in the actual dynamics of historical development and class struggle. They were seen as floating above history, in a way.
Okay. And finally, the source is very explicit about how the communists should act and what their ultimate aims are.
Yes. The manifesto concludes by outlining their position.
Yeah.
They support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order. In every movement, they bring the property question to the forefront, no matter its stage of development, and they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of democratic parties of all countries.
And they're not shy about their intentions.
Not at all. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can only be attained by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. No ambiguity there.
Which leads directly into that unforgettable, world-shaking call to action the source concludes with.
Indeed. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite.
Wow, okay. We've covered a huge amount of ground there. We've gone from the materialist foundation of history, as Marx saw it, through his analysis of capitalism's inner workings and, well, its built-in contradictions. We've traced the inevitable rise and struggle of the proletariat.
Explored the specific role and the pretty concrete program proposed for the communists.
Examined that final vision of a future communist society, and importantly, engaged with that critical perspective from the source itself, questioning the premise that economic change alone can eliminate evil.
Understanding these core ideas, drawn straight from the manifesto, bits of capital, and the supporting text we had, is just fundamental. You really can't grasp so much of modern history and politics without grappling with this text, regardless of where you stand on it. It provides a specific, powerful lens based on this source material for viewing history, society, and conflict.
And maybe the most compelling question to leave you, the listener, with building on that critique we discussed from the source's introduction is this. If evil, if corruption by power and pride isn't solely an economic problem, if it potentially exists in any human system, how does that challenge or maybe reshape our understanding of revolutionary change and the whole pursuit of an ideal society? That's definitely something to mull over.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, as always, is really just the starting point for your own exploration and critical thinking about these incredibly complex and, well, enduring ideas and their legacy.
And to continue that exploration, we definitely recommend you grab a copy of the Communist Manifesto and perhaps some of the accompanying texts discussed. You can find a link in the description. And of course, please subscribe to Books and Bytes to keep unpacking the world's most influential ideas with us.